Welcome to one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night you're tuning in. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. The year was 1862. The Civil War was tearing the nation apart. But deep in the Ozark Mountains, another kind of horror was unfolding, one that would vanish from memory for nearly 100 years. This isn't a story of battlefield glory or political intrigue, but of a shadow that grew unchecked in isolation, far from the reach of law and order. What you're about to hear is pieced together from courthouse archives, military reports, newspaper fragments, personal journals, and scattered artifacts that researchers at Missouri State University finally assembled in 1963. Some names have been changed out of respect for descendants still living in the region, but the locations and timeline remain as the records describe. Life in the Ozarks during 1862 was fragile and unsettled. The rugged hills had always bred a spirit of independence and suspicion of outsiders. When the war broke out, the region became even more cut off, torn between Union and Confederate loyalties. Neighbors who once broke bread together now watched each other with distrust. Army patrols from both sides swept through seizing supplies and questioning allegiances. The dirt roads leading from Springfield through scattered mountain settlements became dangerous corridors where travelers risked ambush or worse. Tiny County sat at the heart of this turmoil. Its county seat, Forsyth, had been burned during military operations in 1861, leaving government in ruins. With the sheriff and most deputies off fighting in the war, law enforcement collapsed. Court records from the time barely survived, reduced to hurried notes carried from place to place as officials fled whichever army happened to be closing in. Within this vacuum of power, predators found the perfect ground to operate unseen. According to land deeds reviewed in the 1960s, a man named Ezekiel Holloway bought a 160-acre spread along the White River in 1848. The property lay at a strategic point where the Springfield Road dipped south toward Arkansas, about 23 miles below Springfield, near present-day Forsyth. The price was unusually high, as noted years later in a 1964 monograph by Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, raising suspicions about how the Holloways could afford it, given their modest roots in eastern Tennessee. That mystery would later be seen as the first clue that the family's fortune wasn't earned honestly. The Holloway homestead itself was far from humble. It boasted a large two-story log house with a stone chimney, a sturdy smokehouse of river rock, a barn big enough to stable 8 horses, and a cluster of smaller outbuildings forming a half circle around a central yard. By 1859, tax assessments placed its value well above neighboring farms, suggesting the Holloways enjoyed unusual prosperity, despite contributing little to the local economy. Dr. Whitfield noted something unusual in her research. For a farm of its size and wealth, there were no records of the Holloways ever selling livestock or crops in proportion to their land. That gap in the record, overlooked at the time, would later take on a disturbing meaning once the family's secrets came to light. The Holloways themselves were a sizable household. Ezekiel, about 53 in 1862, was listed as head of the family. His wife Martha was in her mid-40s and believed to be his second wife, though no trace of his first marriage has ever surfaced. The children included Jeremiah, age 26, Silas, 23, Caleb, 17, Ruth, 19, and Esther, 15. Census notes suggest Martha may have been stepmother to the older children, but all were identified publicly as Ezekiel's. In their early years in Missouri, the family appeared in Baptist church records near Forsyth, but their names abruptly disappear from the congregation's rolls after 1850. A ledger entry hints at concerns about their absence, though no explanation was recorded. This pattern, joining a community only to retreat into isolation, would become a recurring theme wherever they lived. What we know of the Holloways' presence in Taney County comes mostly from neighbors who later gave statements after the family's activities were uncovered. Thomas Wilkins, a farmer just 3 miles away, recalled in 1863 that the Holloways kept to themselves. Ezekiel came to town every few weeks, always civil and always paying in good coin. Martha and the daughters appeared only rarely, quiet and reserved, while the sons were seen even less often, strong young men who never said much and left no impression. Another neighbor, Sarah Thornton, whose husband ran a general store in Forsyth, offered a different perspective in a letter to her sister, discovered in 1959. She wrote that Ezekiel visited monthly with silver in hand, but she had seen Martha only twice in 5 years, describing her as a thin, severe woman whose daughters clung close, eyes downcast. Thornton admitted she was unsettled by the Holloways, remarking that despite their fine farm, they never brought goods to trade as other families did. "Something in the old man's gaze," she wrote, "makes me uneasy. I am not sorry they live at some distance from town." The same eerie impression was echoed by William Cartwright, who carried mail along the Springfield-Forsyth route before the war interrupted service. In an 1867 interview, he remembered the Holloway farm as strangely silent. Where most homesteads rang with livestock laughter and labor, theirs seemed still watchful. He delivered mail there only a handful of times over 3 years. But each time Ezekiel was waiting at the road, as if he knew the exact moment he would arrive. Cartwright was never invited beyond the gate. The Holloways rarely received letters, and when they did, they came almost exclusively from Tennessee or Arkansas. In March of 1862, the Battle of Pea Ridge marked a turning point in the Western theater of the war, securing Missouri for the Union. But that victory brought unintended consequences to the Ozarks. Troops, refugees, and displaced families now flooded the roads, and one of the busiest routes ran straight past the Holloway farm. Supply wagons rumbled by daily. Stragglers, deserters, and frightened families traveled the same dirt road, hoping to find safety or reunite with loved ones. It was in this unsettled spring that the first disappearances were recorded. Taney County records show that between April and November of 1862, at least 17 people vanished along the 20-mile stretch of road that cut past the Holloway property. The reports are brief, just names, dates, and last known locations. A sheriff's note from June 12th mentions a missing traveler near the White River crossing, but adds that with the present hostilities, investigation must be deferred. Union correspondence uncovered a century later in federal archives also alluded to suspicious circumstances in the area. But with war raging across Missouri and Arkansas, no one had the time or the men to look closer. Among the first reported missing was Jonathan Myers, a 42-year-old Springfield merchant. On April 23, 1862, he set out for Batesville, Arkansas, to inspect his warehouse. He never came back. A cavalry patrol recalled seeing a man who fit his description near the White River, but no further trace was ever found. His personal effects, however, were later recovered from the Holloway farm. That summer, the Ballard family, Samuel, 35, his wife Elizabeth, 32, and their 2 children, William, 9, and Mary, 6, fled north after their farm near Batesville was destroyed. They planned to stay with relatives in Springfield and were last seen passing through Forsyth in early June. They never arrived. Years later, items of children's clothing found at the Holloway place were identified by Elizabeth's sister as belonging to William and Mary. Perhaps the most haunting case was that of Emma Whitaker, a 19-year-old school teacher from Harrison, Arkansas. When her school closed due to the war, she set out to return home to Springfield. In a letter dated July 18, 1862, Her father wrote to military authorities in desperation, explaining that Emma had arranged passage with a trader heading north and was expected to arrive by mid-July. She never did. A locket containing her portrait, later identified by her grieving father, was recovered among the Holloway possessions. What made these cases so chilling was not only the sheer number of victims, but the cold, organized method investigators would later uncover. The Holloways were not simply killers. They treated their victims the way they treated livestock, systematically, with precision and without mercy. In 1957, during a renovation of the old Holloway property, a loose stone in the chimney revealed a hidden journal. Its pages, later analyzed by researchers who dated it to 1861 to 1862, contained some of the most disturbing evidence ever recovered from the Ozarks. The Holloways referred to their victims as provisions, selecting them for apparent health and size. Each entry followed the same grim structure: a short description of the individual, the date of acquisition, the method of processing, and the resulting yield. One notation read, "Male approx. 30 years good condition yielded 67 pounds of usable product." Another recorded female older, less satisfactory yield, but bones made excellent stock. The cold precision of these records shocked even seasoned investigators. Dr. Theodore Montgomery of the Smithsonian, who examined the journal alongside skeletal remains, recovered from the site, concluded that the Holloways displayed a complete moral disconnection from the humanity of the victims. Their entries, he wrote, could just as easily have described the slaughter of cattle or hogs. The journal, now locked away in the Missouri State Archives, contains roughly 40 entries over an 18-month span. Some even detail experimentation, as if refining a craft. A September 1861 entry observed young male subjects provide optimal ratio of muscle to fat. Processing should commence within 4 hours of acquisition to ensure quality. In January 1862, another note praised a winter preservation method using snowpack and salt, recording that a sample from November remained in excellent condition after 60 days. In the war-torn isolation of the White River Valley, there were few eyes to notice. Homesteads were miles apart, roads were dangerous, and with mail service disrupted and soldiers moving constantly through the region, the Holloways operated in near secrecy. Their neighbors were scattered, cut off, and powerless. Only one detailed account survives from someone who encountered the Holloways and lived to tell the tale. In 1863, a man named Jacob Cranston gave a deposition preserved in Union intelligence files. He recalled arriving at the Holloway farm near sunset. Ezekiel, splitting wood in the yard, welcomed him and offered food and a bed in the barn, warning of deserters and bushwhackers on the road. Cranston described the evening meal. The younger daughter served a stew, but didn't touch it herself, while Martha and the older girl lingered in the kitchen, silent and watchful. The son spoke in hushed tones he couldn't quite make out. During conversation, Ezekiel pressed him about where he was headed and who might be expecting him. When Cranston admitted he had no fixed destination, he noticed a change in the old man's eyes, a flicker that made him uneasy, even as the fire glowed in the hearth. Later, tending his horse in the barn, Cranston overheard two of the Holloway sons whispering. Their words were brief but unforgettable. "Prepare the smokehouse. Check the hooks." Sensing danger, Jacob Cranston slipped away in the dead of night. He abandoned his saddle and pack, choosing silence over the risk of waking the family. For nearly 2 days, he traveled on foot through the rugged Ozark wilderness before stumbling into a Union patrol. He told them of his suspicions, but his report, like so many others in that time of chaos, was filed away and forgotten until after the war. Another troubling account surfaced in a letter dated September 1862. Written by Mary Whittam to her brother in St. Louis, she described how her family's wagon had broken near a river crossing and a local household offered help. The father and sons repaired the wheel, while the mother and daughters served food. Whittem noted her children were unsettled by how silent the Holloway girls were, and later whispered that they had seen dark stains on the back of one daughter's apron. She brushed it off as the normal work of butchering, but her husband confided later that something about the farm seemed wrong. For all its apparent prosperity, there were no animals in the fields, no sound of livestock in the barns. They left in haste, her husband urging speed even as darkness fell. What finally exposed the Holloway homestead was not whispers of suspicion, but an accident of war. In December 1862, a Union cavalry patrol under Lieutenant Samuel Whitaker pursued Confederate guerrillas through the Ozarks. A winter storm forced them to seek shelter, and they came upon what seemed an abandoned farmstead. In his official report, Whitaker was measured in his words, noting only human remains in various states of preservation and evidence of systematic processing. But the truth preserved in a private letter was far more horrific. Sergeant James McPherson wrote to his brother in Illinois, later donating the letter to the Missouri Historical Society in 1958. He recalled arriving at the Holloway farm to find it eerily deserted, the chimney still warm, as if the occupants had fled only hours earlier. What they discovered inside, he wrote, made hardened soldiers recoil. The smokehouse contained meat not from cattle or hogs, but unmistakably human. Barrels in the cellar held preserved cuts floating in brine. In the barn, they uncovered watches, rings, spectacles and boots, personal effects neatly sorted and cataloged, as if each victim had been processed and inventoried. A trunk of clothing held garments of all sizes folded carefully, each tagged with what appeared to be a date. The most horrifying find lay beneath the cabin in the root cellar. Bones stacked like firewood, some split open to extract the marrow. By McPherson's count, at least 9 individuals, though likely more. A massive copper kettle stood in one corner, its interior stained in ways he refused to describe. Along the walls hung saws, knives, and cleavers, each sharpened, cleaned, and hung in perfect order. One soldier, who had once worked in his father's butcher shop, whispered with revulsion that the tools were arranged exactly as they would be in a professional slaughterhouse. Private Thomas Jenkins, one of the soldiers in Whitaker's patrol, left behind perhaps the most haunting account of all. In a journal entry dated December 19, 1862, he wrote, "What we found in that place has destroyed my faith in the inherent goodness of mankind." Beyond the tools and bones already noted by his comrades, Jenkins described a small chamber adjoining the cellar. Iron rings were set into the stone wall chains still dangling. In the center of the floor, a drain led to a covered pit just outside the foundation. Every detail suggested deliberate planning, as if the Holloways had designed the room with one purpose in mind: efficient preparation of human beings, the way a farmer might process livestock. Jenkins concluded grimly that this cold, methodical arrangement was far more horrifying than any sudden act of battlefield violence he had witnessed. The Army's response was shaped by necessity. With Confederate guerrillas still active in the area, the patrol gathered what evidence they could carry, among it the ledger and several personal effects believed to belong to missing travelers, then set the buildings ablaze. Lieutenant Whitaker's official report closed with a sober recommendation once the war was over. He wrote a full investigation should be made to determine the scale of the atrocities committed at the site. That investigation would not come for almost 100 years. The Holloways themselves vanished into the fog of war. With Missouri consumed by brutal guerrilla fighting, the attention of both military and civilian authorities turned to larger battles and more immediate threats. In the chaos, the Holloways became just another name, scribbled in the margins of overflowing ledgers. A few reports flickered across the record in later years. A family resembling them spotted in southern Arkansas in 1864, whispers of disappearances near Shreveport in 1866. But nothing conclusive. A wanted notice published in the Arkansas Gazette in July 1865 described Ezekiel Holloway and his family, offering a reward for information. They were wanted for questioning regarding disappearances, but no responses were ever recorded. Slowly, the case slipped from official memory, surviving only in scraps of folklore and the scattered testimony of survivors. Yet, not everyone forgot. In 1967, researchers uncovered a memo in the archives of the Freedmen's Bureau dated March 1866. It instructed field agents in Louisiana and eastern Texas to remain alert for the Holloway family, known to have engaged in predatory activities in Missouri during the late conflict. The description matched Ezekiel, a tall, gaunt man with a gray beard and an unfeeling gaze, accompanied by a wife, 3 sons and 2 daughters. Whether they changed their names or simply moved farther south, the trail ended there. No follow-up reports have ever been found. The immediate aftermath of the discovery at the Holloway place can only be pieced together from fragmentary correspondence. Colonel William McDowell, commanding Union forces in Springfield, acknowledged Whitaker's report in a dispatch, writing that the atrocities are of such a nature as to warrant investigation, but current exigencies preclude allocation of resources to civilian criminal matters, however heinous. Brigadier General James Totten echoed the sentiment in a January 1863 letter to the Provost Marshal in St. Louis. Amid countless reports of war crimes and lawlessness, Totten wrote, "Whitaker's account stands out as particularly disturbing." Even so, no investigation followed. Lieutenant Whitaker had urged civilian authorities to pursue the matter if the Holloways were ever apprehended. But no such effort was ever made. By early 1863, Missouri was reeling from the aftermath of the Battle of Prairie Grove. Civilian government had crumbled, and the Provost Marshal's office in Yausant, Louis, overwhelmed with cases tied directly to the war, simply filed the Holloway report away. For nearly a century, the case remained buried in obscurity. It wasn't until 1961 that the story returned to light. While researching Civil War-era crimes for her doctoral dissertation at the University of Arkansas, Dr. Eleanor Whitfield uncovered references to the Holloways in archival military correspondence. At first, she viewed the case as little more than an extreme example of wartime lawlessness. But as she followed the trail, Whitfield became convinced the family's crimes were far greater than the scattered records suggested. In a 1962 interview for the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, she explained, "What began as a footnote in my broader study of Civil War criminality gradually emerged as something much more significant. The Holloway case shows how completely moral structures can collapse under certain conditions. This family appears to have constructed its own moral universe separate from society while presenting a mask of normalcy to outsiders." Whitfield's continued research, blending archival evidence with archaeological work, pointed to a broader timeline. County death records hinted at unexplained disappearances in the White River region as early as 1854, years before the war. Many were attributed at the time to bandits or accidents. But when placed against the Holloway timeline, they seemed far less random. Even more disturbing disappearances followed the family's suspected route of flight after abandoning Missouri in late 1862. Proving these suspicions meant returning to the Holloway property itself. By then, the landscape had changed dramatically. After the homestead was burned in 1862, decades of erosion and regrowth reclaimed the land, and in the 1950s, the rising waters of Bull Shoals Lake swallowed much of the site. Undeterred, Whitfield secured funding from the University of Arkansas and permission from the Army Corps of Engineers to conduct limited excavations during the summer of 1963, when lake levels were lowest. The work was arduous. As Dr. James Thornton of the University of Missouri later noted, Much of the site was permanently submerged, and what remained had been disturbed by dam construction and shoreline erosion. Even so, the excavation uncovered chilling confirmation of Whitaker's 1862 report. The stone foundation of the Holloway cabin and its outbuildings matched the military descriptions exactly. The root cellar was still intact, complete with the drainage system described by Private Jenkins. Among the debris were iron shackles hooks consistent with slaughterhouse use and fragments of tools blackened but still recognizable from the fire. Most unsettling of all were the remains. Human bones, some bearing marks of deliberate cutting, were recovered from the cellar. Though badly degraded by time, water, and fire, they bore silent witness to the crimes that official authorities had ignored a century earlier. Excavations at the Holloway site ultimately yielded bone fragments from at least 23 individuals recovered from the root cellar and smokehouse remains. The Smithsonian Institution's Dr. Theodore Montgomery led the forensic analysis, and his findings left no doubt about the nature of the Holloways' activities. The bones bore unmistakable signs of systematic butchery cut marks consistent with livestock processing made with sharp, well-maintained tools handled by experienced hands. Some bones had been exposed to smoke and fire, others stained from brine preservation. The remains revealed a chilling cross-section of travelers, men and women, ranging from their teens into their 60s, along with 2 adolescents between the ages of 10 and 15. No infant or very young child remains were found, though Dr. Montgomery cautioned that this absence might reflect disposal methods rather than a deliberate choice of victims. Equally disturbing were the personal items recovered with the bones. Buttons, hairpins, dentures, and other small belongings had been carefully sorted and stored in wooden boxes, suggesting a ritualistic dimension beyond survival or pragmatism. A fragmentary journal nearly destroyed by decades of exposure contained what appeared to be recipes and preparation notes so grotesque that researchers refused to publish them directly. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield wrote only that the contents displayed a disturbing level of experimentation and refinement of techniques over time. From Whitfield's research emerged a portrait of the Holloways as a family unit operating with terrifying efficiency. They targeted travelers who appeared vulnerable, those journeying alone or in small groups unlikely to be missed quickly. Hospitality was their lure. In the isolated Ozarks, a warm meal and a place to rest could mean survival, and the Holloways exploited that trust to assess and ensnare their victims. The Civil War's chaos gave them cover, but evidence suggested they had practiced such predation long before the conflict began. Whitfield traced their origins back to eastern Tennessee, where county records between 1843 and 1847 revealed a similar pattern of unexplained disappearances. A sheriff's report from 1847 noted suspicions about a family named Holloway, after neighbors complained of smoke at unusual hours and strange sounds at night. The inquiry ended abruptly when the family left the area, but Whitfield argued that the Missouri atrocities were not a sudden wartime aberration. They were the continuation of a long-established pattern. Most disturbing of all was the evidence that every member of the family participated. A journal entry believed to have been written by one of the Holloway daughters described helping prepare the day's yield with the same casual tone a farm child might use to describe feeding livestock. The normalization of such acts within the family created what researchers described as a self-contained predatory organism, a social unit whose moral framework had been inverted. In 1966, Dr. Robert Lancaster of Vanderbilt University conducted a retrospective psychological assessment based on the historical record. He concluded that patriarch Ezekiel Holloway likely displayed traits consistent with what modern clinicians would call antisocial personality disorder. Lancaster wrote, "The apparent lack of remorse, The methodical nature of the killings and the transformation of the entire family into accomplices suggests a patriarch with extraordinary power to impose his will. Within the Holloway household, ordinary moral prohibitions were replaced by a utilitarian calculus in which human life was simply another resource. Lancaster's assessment also addressed the rare phenomenon of whole family criminality. In most cases, he noted some members remained passive or reluctant participants. The Holloways were different. The evidence suggested total involvement, each member contributing to the system in a way that blurred the line between family and conspiracy. What set the Holloway case apart from most known examples of family-based crime was the evidence of total participation. Not only the parents and older sons, but even the younger daughters appeared to have been involved. Whether this was the result of Ezekiel's coercion or the children being raised from birth inside a twisted moral system remains unclear. Either possibility is deeply unsettling. What became of the Holloways after they fled Missouri in December 1862 has never been definitively answered, but Dr. Eleanor Whitfield's research uncovered disturbing hints that their story did not end in the Ozarks. In the 1870 census, a family named Holland appears in northeastern Texas. Their ages and first names align almost exactly with those of the Holloways. Around the same time, local newspapers carried scattered reports of travelers disappearing under mysterious circumstances in that very region. A Bowie County Sheriff's report from October 1871 noted a troubling pattern. Several travelers had failed to reach their destinations after passing through the northeastern part of the county, the same area where the Holland family had recently settled on an isolated farm. Whitfield pointed out the familiar sequence: an isolated homestead along a travel route, buildings featuring a root cellar and smokehouse, a brief period of surface-level integration with the community, followed by unexplained disappearances that drew little attention because the victims were transient. Further evidence emerged in 1965 when the Arkansas Historical Society received a collection of letters belonging to William Burnett, a Confederate veteran. One letter dated July 1867 described an encounter with a strange family recently arrived from Missouri who pressed him to join them for supper. Burnett declined, writing that he felt unsettled by the way they looked at me as if assessing a horse for purchase. His description of the patriarch, a tall, gaunt man with a long gray beard and cold eyes, matches accounts of Ezekiel Holloway. Burnett noted other unsettling details. The homestead supposedly new appeared suspiciously well established, complete with a large smokehouse. When Burnett showed interest in its construction, the eldest son blocked his approach. Stranger still, there were no cattle, no hogs, only 2 horses and a scattering of chickens. When Burnett inquired about the absence of stock, the old man replied that they had not yet had time to build their herds, but insisted they were adequately provisioned. Burnett admitted that something in his tone chilled him, and he chose to continue on his way, despite the gathering night. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue comes from the records of the Texas Rangers. In March 1873, Rangers investigated a family named Holloway living near the Sabine River. When they reached the property, they found it recently abandoned. Inside, they discovered what one report called evidence of practices inconsistent with legitimate farming or hunting. The Rangers described a large underground chamber containing suspicious implements and barrels filled with preserved material that a physician refused to identify definitively. The case was abruptly closed, the family vanished once again, and the trail went cold. The last solid piece of evidence in the Holloway saga surfaced in 1968, when construction crews widening Highway 63 near Hardy, Arkansas, unearthed a mass grave. Inside were the remains of at least 11 individuals. Forensic analysis by the Arkansas State Medical Examiner dated the bones to roughly 1867 to 1869. Disturbingly, many bore the same distinctive butchery marks first documented at the Holloway homestead in Missouri. Local property records revealed that a family named Holloway had briefly owned land near Hardy during that same period before disappearing once again. The investigation was quickly closed, officials citing the century that had passed the presumed death of all involved parties and the lack of a living suspect. Yet the echoes of Missouri were unmistakable. Dr. Malcolm Jenkins, who examined the remains, noted in his report that the precision of the cuts, the systematic disassembly, and even the preservation techniques were consistent with those attributed to the Holloways. His conclusion was stark. Either the same perpetrators had continued their work, or someone had replicated their grisly methods in chilling detail. This discovery near Hardy remains the final piece of concrete evidence linking the Holloways to active crimes. Beyond it, the trail grows more speculative, though not without tantalizing clues. In the mid-1870s, newspapers from eastern Texas reported a troubling pattern of disappearances near Jefferson, then a bustling river port. An article in the Marshall Republican from November 1874 described growing alarm as travelers vanished along the route between Jefferson and Shreveport, prompting calls for heavier patrols. One of the most intriguing finds came not from police archives, but from the records of the Texas State Asylum in Austin. In 1878, a patient identified only as CH was admitted suffering from what doctors described as acute melancholia and delusional claims. Among those claims was a confession that he had once belonged to a family of manhunters who preyed upon travelers at the edge of civilization. The patient died the following year, his true identity never confirmed. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield speculated that CH may have been Caleb Holloway, the youngest son who would have been in his early 30s at the time. But without definitive proof, the connection remains only conjecture. What ultimately drove the Holloways to such extremes remains unsolved. Some historians argue that the brutal isolation of frontier life, compounded by the moral collapse of civil war, created fertile ground for such horrors to grow unchecked. Others suggest something darker, that the Holloways were not a product of circumstance, but of a deeply entrenched family pathology, one that transformed ordinary survival skills into an intergenerational system of predation. Whatever the cause, the Holloway case remains one of the most chilling reminders of how fragile the boundaries of civilization can be. Some historians argue that the Holloways were simply a family with antisocial tendencies, their isolation magnifying traits that erupted when war created opportunity. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, however, reached a darker conclusion in her 1964 monograph. She suggested the Holloways were not driven by madness or desperation, but by a cold pragmatism twisted into something monstrous. The Holloways appear to have decided that other humans were simply another resource to be harvested, she wrote. Their methodical approach, their record-keeping, their careful processing of remains, all suggest not frenzied violence, but a calculated decision that human life was a commodity. The Civil War, with its widespread dehumanization of the enemy and the collapse of social norms, may have simply provided further justification for practices they had already begun. The impact on surrounding communities was profound, though rarely documented directly. One letter from a Forsyth resident in 1863 mentioned that since the terrible discoveries at the Holloway place, neighbors had grown wary of both strangers and of those who offered them shelter. In a region where hospitality had once been essential to survival, trust had been shattered. Suspicion lingered for generations, reshaping the cultural fabric of the Ozarks. Today, the Holloway homestead lies beneath the waters of Bull Shoals Lake, inundated by the damming of the White River in the 1950s. The flooding occurred before the site's full archaeological significance was realized, erasing what might have been critical evidence. Perhaps it is fitting that this place of horror has been swallowed by water. Yet the story itself refuses to remain submerged. Fragmentary records, unearthed journals, and chilling details preserved in military reports still sketch a picture of methodical evil that unsettles our understanding of human nature. Local folklore has woven the Holloways into legend. Fishermen on Bull Shoals Lake sometimes speak of strange lights or eerie sounds near the drowned foundations. Tales of hauntings where the family once lived. Historians dismiss these as the natural attempt to process horror through the lens of the supernatural. The truth, they argue, is far more unsettling, that the Holloways were not ghosts, but people. Flesh and blood. Humans who made choices. Dr. James Thornton, who participated in the excavation of the site in the 1960s, summarized it best in a 1967 article. It is easier to imagine monsters or spirits than to confront the reality that ordinary families under certain conditions can create their own moral universe where atrocity becomes routine. Folklore surrounding the Holloways has long been steeped in the supernatural spirits of their victims seeking vengeance, whispers that the family possessed inhuman abilities, or that the land itself carried a curse. These stories, though vivid, serve an important purpose. They allow communities to push the horror into the realm of the otherworldly, making it easier to accept. Because the alternative, the truth recorded in ledger's bones and testimony, is that the Holloways were not monsters in the supernatural sense, but ordinary people who crossed a line and never returned. Their crimes were not wild frenzies, but acts of methodical calculation carried out with chilling precision. That reality is far more disturbing than any ghost story. As for the Holloways themselves, the trail fades after the grisly discoveries near Hardy, Arkansas in the late 1860s. Some researchers believe the family simply kept moving, shifting their name whenever suspicions grew too sharp. Others suggest a darker end, that they may have finally fallen victim to one of their intended targets. A newspaper from Shreveport, Louisiana, dated 1876, briefly reports the killing of an elderly man with a long gray beard found with his throat cut in a boarding house. No one in town knew him, and he had arrived only days before. The resemblance to Ezekiel Holloway is striking, but the evidence is too thin to draw a definitive link. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, in her final paper published shortly before her death in 1967, offered a different possibility. She suggested the family may have ultimately scattered the younger members, slipping into other communities, their past buried and unspoken. Census records from 1880 show individuals with matching first names and ages spread across Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Whether these were truly the Holloways or only coincidence may never be known. Without DNA evidence, no definitive connections can ever be drawn. But as Dr. Eleanor Whitfield once wrote, perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that descendants of the Holloways live among us, still carrying the genetic legacy, if not the practices, of one of America's most methodical, predatory families. A final chilling note surfaced in 1968 at a nursing home in Texarkana. An elderly woman admitted under the name Elizabeth Harrison began during episodes of dementia to speak of helping her father in the smokehouse and processing the travelers. Staff reported these statements, but when lucid, the woman denied them, refusing to discuss her past. Some researchers suspected she might have been Esther Holloway, the youngest daughter. Efforts to verify her identity proved inconclusive, and she died in early 1969 before an interview could be conducted. Whether she truly was Esther or simply a woman echoing local folklore will never be known. With her death, the trail of the Holloways faded into silence. Their ultimate fate remains as murky as the waters of Bull Shoals Lake that now cover the site of their crimes. The Missouri State Archives still lists the Holloway case as technically unsolved, though all participants are presumed long dead. Yet the Holloway legacy endures not in conviction or confession, but in what it reveals about the fragility of civilization. In the isolated Ozarks, with society fractured by war, The Holloways built a private moral universe where human life was reduced to resource. Their story is preserved only in fragments, military reports scribbled in the margins of larger concerns, land deeds that mark ownership without context, bones and tools unearthed long after the fact. And perhaps that fragmentary nature makes the case all the more unsettling. The missing pieces invite the imagination to fill the void, often with horrors greater than the documented truth. The Ozarks of today bear little resemblance to the frontier of 1862. Roads now wind easily through once impenetrable hills. Tourists gather at lakes formed by dams. The isolation that sheltered the Holloways has largely disappeared. And yet travelers still report unease on lonely stretches of road after dark. Folklore says it is the spirits of their victims that haunt these woods. But perhaps what lingers here is not supernatural at all. It is the knowledge that such cold, calculated evil once thrived behind the mask of frontier hospitality. As one elderly resident of Taney County told Dr. Whitfield during her research, "Some stories ain't meant to be forgotten, even when they curdle your blood to hear them." The Holloways are gone, but remembering what they did might just make folks a bit more careful about who they trust and where they stop when traveling these hills. The Holloway case stands as one of America's darkest historical reminders that sometimes an open door, a warm meal, and a friendly smile can conceal intentions more terrifying than any ghost story.